The rain tapped against the window of my small, dimly lit apartment as if it were whispering secrets only I could understand. I sat in the corner, hunched over with my head bowed, playing the role the world had assigned to me. The weak one? The fragile one, the man no one took seriously. My neighbors passed me by without a glance, coworkers mocked me behind my back, and even my own relatives pitied me with their condescending smiles. To them, I was invisible, harmless, someone who could never stand up for himself. And for years, I let them believe that. But what they didn't know was that every cruel word, every sneer, every act of betrayal was fuel. I was biding my time, waiting for the day when masks would fall and truths would surface. Waiting for the day I would finally reveal who I truly was. It all began in my workplace. I worked at a large corporation where ambition and greed ruled over loyalty and kindness. My manager, Victor, was the kind of man who preyed on weakness. He had a square jaw, a booming laugh, and a cruel glint in his eyes whenever he singled me out. "Daniel," he would bark, tossing files onto my desk. "You're slow, clumsy, useless. Just do the grunt work and stay out of the way of real employees." Everyone laughed because Victor set the tone, and no one dared to challenge him. I pretended to stumble, to apologize, to lower my head in shame. I let them think I was harmless, a pushover who could be stepped on. But inside my mind was sharp, calculating, remembering every slight. I had once been more than this, though no one knew. Years ago, I had trained in ways most couldn't imagine, studied strategies, learned patience, discipline, and restraint. But life had pushed me into shadows, and I chose to hide my fire, until the day came when I could use it. The breaking point came when Victor humiliated me in front of everyone during a company event. He had caught me in the break room, carrying coffee for the senior staff. In front of the board of directors, he smirked and shouted, "Look at Daniel, our office servant. Maybe one day he'll be promoted to janitor." Laughter erupted. My hands trembled, not from shame but from the effort of controlling myself. My eyes flicked across the room, noting who laughed the loudest, who avoided my gaze, who secretly pitied me. My list of names was growing. That night, I returned home and stared into the cracked mirror above my sink. The man looking back at me wasn't weak. He wasn't helpless. He was waiting. And I whispered to my reflection, soon. The first chance came unexpectedly. A coworker, Melissa, approached me one evening as I was packing up. She was different from the others. Quiet, reserved, yet I had seen her struggle under Victor's cruelty too. She whispered, "I know they're unfair to you, to us, but you never fight back." "Why?" Her eyes searched mine, almost accusing. I forced a sad smile, keeping my mask in place. "Because fighting back only makes things worse." But deep inside, I knew the truth. Fighting back too soon would waste everything I had been preparing. The game wasn't about surviving. It was about timing. Melissa didn't believe me, and perhaps that was good. The fewer people who suspected, the cleaner my path would be when the time came. Then came the betrayal that sealed their fate. One Friday, Victor announced a major project presentation. I had contributed the bulk of the research, the late nights, the sleepless weekends. But when the meeting came, he stood before the boardroom, presenting my work as his own. He didn't even mention my name. He basked in the applause, while I sat in the corner like a forgotten ghost. Afterward, as the board members left, Victor leaned down, smirking. "Did you really think your pathetic efforts would earn you recognition?" "You're nothing, Daniel." "Nothing." I didn't answer. I just nodded, letting him think he'd won. But inside, something clicked. The waiting was over. The plan that had been forming in the shadows of my mind finally began to move. From that day, I played the part even better. I stumbled more, acted clumsier, gave them every reason to underestimate me. They laughed louder, mocked more openly, thinking I was crumbling. But I was watching, memorizing their weaknesses, their routines, their secrets. At night, when the city grew quiet, I trained. The old strength in my body returned with each strike of my fists against the worn punching bag. The skills I had buried deep resurfaced, sharper than ever. Every bead of sweat was a promise. A promise that when I struck back, it would not be a single act of anger but a storm they would never recover from. And then, one night, standing on the rooftop of my building with the cold wind cutting across my face, I whispered the words that had been burning inside me for years. They thought I was weak. They thought I was helpless. But soon they'll see who I really am. The stage was set. The weak man was dead. They applauded him again the next morning as if applause could cure the rot in their souls. Victor swaggered through the office like a man who owned the place, chest puffed, tie immaculate, eyes hunting for the next performance. Everyone fell in line. I watched from my desk, the hum of the fluorescent lights turning into a steady drumbeat in my ears. The plan was no longer a vague promise. It had become a machine, and I had to oil every cog, time every gear. The first move required patience and a small, almost insignificant kindness. Melissa was struggling under the weight of debt. I had learned that in a passing conversation over stale coffee. No one else knew. So I started leaving her small, anonymous notes of encouragement in the copier, in her drawer, on the inside of her lunchbox. They were so minor that she barely noticed the pattern at first, but the effect was immediate. Her shoulders loosened. She smiled more. She began to speak up in meetings, timidly at first, then with a clarity that made people look. When she started to contribute, Victor scowled. He hated anything that wasn't praise of himself. "Who's been feeding her lines?" he muttered one afternoon, voice low so only his inner circle could hear. "She's trying to look important." He made it mine by default. Because I was the quiet one, his suspicion was a small ember. I let it glow. Meanwhile, I cultivated the appearance of decline. I let my inbox overflow, missed deadlines intentionally, spilled coffee on my shirt when clients came. I smiled apologetically, begged for mercy when reprimanded. It was theater, and I was a seasoned actor. They applauded the tragedy of my incompetence. They were careful to keep me busy with the office's most menial tasks. The tasks that gave no one power or prestige. Perfect. In quiet hours, I began to map the office like a general studies a battlefield. Where Victor kept his USBs, which drawers had lax locks, whose loyalty was bought with lunch and whose loyalty had price tags that could be exploited. I learned that Raj in IT had an ego the size of a mountain and a gambling problem smaller than a coin. Raj enjoyed praise more than ethics, and praise could be crafted. I befriended him with stories of mutual disdain for Victor, coaxed him with flattery, bought his trust with small, technically harmless favors that made him feel indispensable. He started leaving his workstation unlocked. He started to talk. Victor is soft where it counts. He confided late one night over greasy fries. His passwords are predictable. Guy uses his dog's name and his birthday for everything. He laughed, then frowned, suddenly aware of what he'd shared. I smiled and wrote it all down. Every detail was another thread I could pull at when the tapestry had to unravel. I also fed the rumor mill, but carefully. Offices are full of thirsty mouths, ready to amplify a whisper into an anthem. I let a casual comment slip. I overheard Victor's assistant say he's worried about a partner at home. Sounds messy. The rumor spread like spilled ink. People leaned in when Victor walked by. Eyes followed him with the same curiosity a moth gives a flame. Victor, who once stoked fires of humiliation, now found himself under a smaller, more sinister heat. He tightened. He scowled. He made mistakes. The second piece of the plan was subtler. Leverage. I needed something that would make the board listen when I pulled the curtain. I began to document everything, emails with missing attachments that conveniently proved Victor's oversight. Calendar invites that showed meetings he'd claimed attendance at, but had skipped, drafts of proposals with my edits that bore digital timestamps. I copied files into a personal drive hidden behind the innocuous name, library. I learned to move through the server with the careful grace of someone who knows the building's pipes. It wasn't hacking in the cinematic sense. It was observation, patience, and seizing opportunities when people left their doors open. At home, the rooftop nights grew colder. I wrote lists and crossed names off with a strange mix of satisfaction and hunger. There were the loud ones who had mocked me, Victor, his clique, and the silent ones who had watched and done nothing. Their apathy had been its own kind of crime. I planned not only to expose Victor, but to reveal the network of complacency that allowed him to thrive. If I could show the board that their culture was rotten, inept, vulnerable, then no single scapegoat could survive. They would have to cut deeper. One evening my old trainer's words came back to me. Power, he'd said, is less about strength and more about control. I had control of the narrative now. Control meant setting the scene so every pawn thought they were moving of their own volition. I whispered into that scene, coaxed their choices like a puppeteer guiding strings. The night I enacted the first deliberate exposure, the office hum had turned into a pulse I could feel beneath my skin. Victor hosted his typical late-night drink for a few handpicked seniors, the ritual before big quarterly wins. I arranged to be called in on a fabricated emergency, a printing problem that only I could fix. Everyone assumed I was incompetent enough to break the copier permanently. They chuckled, they sipped. They puffed on power and believed it eternal. I walked into that gathering carrying a single, innocuous USB labeled Q3 Summary. It contained my carefully curated evidence versions of the presentation with my name on the drafts, email chains proving Victor had lifted my work, and a spreadsheet of financial discrepancies compiled by George from accounting. A man who never had the guts to speak up but who had been quietly injured by Victor's bad deals. I didn't plug the USB into the conference room projector. That would have been crude. Instead, I walked to Melissa, who was cleaning a coffee spill by the table, and slipped it into her purse with the casualness of a man handing over a mint. Later, When the party thinned and the senior staff drifted towards cigars and shallow applause, Melissa opened her purse to find the USB. Her expression changed from puzzled to bewildered, and then to something else. A spark of righteous fury. She looked up at me with new eyes, and in that moment I saw the plan take its first breath. Victor's laughter rang out like a bell that evening, and then faded into a sigh. He didn't realize the stage had shifted. He thought he controlled the night because he had always controlled the night. He had counted on me being invisible. He had counted on everyone believing the story he had written for me. And he had misread the one thing that would undo him, the power of a person who had nothing left to lose but everything to expose. The morning after that party, the office air carried an edge. You could feel it in the silence between keystrokes, in the cautious way people glanced at each other. Melissa was quieter than usual, her eyes darting to me more than once. She hadn't confronted me, hadn't spoken a word, but I knew she had looked at that USB. She had seen the files. The truth had sunk its claws into her. By mid-afternoon, she walked past my desk and paused just long enough to whisper, "Why me?" Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of responsibility. I raised my eyes and gave her the faintest of smiles. "Because you'll know what to do." It was both a burden and a gift, and she understood that. Melissa wasn't like the others. She had been burned by Victor too many times. He had passed her up for promotions, stolen her credit, belittled her when she dared to speak. The fire in her chest had been waiting for oxygen. I had just given her the match. The beauty of revenge lies not in the strike itself, but in the chain reaction it creates. I didn't need to storm into a meeting and demand justice. That would only make me look bitter, vengeful, petty. No, I needed them to reveal themselves, to expose their cruelty under their own weight. And Melissa was the perfect catalyst. That week, Victor strutted through the halls like a king, unaware his castle was already on fire. He berated interns, snapped at Raj and IT, even had the audacity to tell Melissa her ideas were cute but irrelevant. I watched her bite her tongue, her fingers twitching like she was itching to slam the USB into the nearest projector. But she didn't. She was learning patience. Meanwhile, I set the next domino. I began leaking small inconsistencies to the board, but indirectly. A misplaced report here, a forwarded email there. Nothing too obvious, nothing traceable, just enough to plant seeds of doubt. I made sure those seeds sprouted at the exact moments when Victor was basking in glory. Every compliment he received was paired with a whisper of suspicion behind closed doors. Raj, intoxicated by the praise I fed him, unknowingly became my messenger. I let him believe he was uncovering Victor's carelessness on his own. "Man, the guy's sloppy," Raj told me one night, scrolling through logs he should have been protecting. "Look at this. He didn't even encrypt half of these files. If anyone wanted to dig, they'd find." He cut himself off, realizing what he was admitting. But I encouraged him, nudging him deeper into the role of whistleblower. His ego made him reckless. By Thursday, the office buzzed with unease. A senior director was overheard questioning why Victor's reports always seemed to line up too perfectly, why his numbers never reflected the struggles everyone else faced. Melissa started dropping pointed questions in meetings, cloaked as innocent curiosity. "Victor, could you walk us through how you achieved that metric? It's just impressive." Her tone was sugar, but her eyes were knives. Victor snapped at her. The room shifted. People noticed. For the first time, they saw the cracks in his armor. That night, as the office emptied, Victor cornered me near the elevator. His eyes burned with suspicion. "I know you've been running your mouth," he hissed, his voice low but venomous. "Don't think I haven't noticed." Melissa suddenly growing a spine. "You think I can't crush you both?" I lowered my gaze, hunched my shoulders, played the part to perfection. "I'm sorry, Victor, I'd never." "Shut up," he barked, shoving a finger into my chest. "You're pathetic. Always will be." Then he stormed off, satisfied with my display of weakness. He had no idea the cameras in the lobby had caught every second of his aggression. And Raj. Well, Raj had access to those cameras. I didn't need to lift a finger. I only needed to be the spark that lit the fuse. 2 days later, Melissa sent out an email, not just to Victor, not just to the board, to everyone, the entire office. Attached were files from the USB, carefully selected pieces of evidence, my draft stamped with dates weeks before Victor's final presentation, financial discrepancies tied to his name, and a video clip of him berating me in the lobby, spitting venom while I cowered like the helpless man they all thought I was. The silence after that email was deafening. I sat at my desk, pretending to be confused, pretending to be afraid of the fallout. Around me, people whispered, gasped, shifted in their chairs. Screens glowed with damning truths. Victor burst into the office minutes later, face red, shouting, "Who did this?" Who the hell? But his voice drowned under the weight of eyes finally seeing him for what he was. Melissa stood. Her voice was steady, calm, almost cold. "We all know who did this, Victor. You did." The room erupted. Some gasped, some clapped, some stayed frozen. The tide had turned, and Victor knew it. He sputtered, threatened lawsuits, cursed everyone in sight. But the more he raged, the more pitiful he became. The king was naked, and no one wanted to kneel anymore. That night, as I walked home beneath the city lights, a strange calm washed over me. It wasn't victory yet. No, this was just the fracture. The real collapse was coming. But the first stone had been cast, and it had shattered the illusion they had built around me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the invisible man. I felt like the storm that had been gathering in silence. Victor didn't go quietly. Men like him never do. When cornered, they claw, they bite, they scream. That Monday morning, he stormed into the office as though nothing had happened, his tie tight, his chin raised. He acted as if the scandal were just an inconvenient rumor, one that would die if ignored long enough. But the office wasn't the same anymore. Conversations hushed when he walked by, glances lingered a second too long. Respect had curdled into suspicion. The board called an emergency meeting. I wasn't invited, of course. The helpless office ghost had no seat at that table. But I didn't need one. Melissa went in, shoulders squared, eyes unflinching, and I knew she carried the fire with her. Hours later, the meeting ended with a silence heavier than thunder. Victor came out red, faced, jaw clenched, his hand gripping his phone like he wanted to crush it. He barked at his assistant, cursed at Raj, and when his eyes landed on me, they burned with something raw and dangerous. That evening, as the office emptied, I stayed behind, pretending to shuffle papers. I felt his presence before I heard him. The air thickened. Then his voice, low, guttural. "You think you've won, don't you?" I looked up, let my eyes widen with just enough fear to feed his delusion. "I don't know what you mean." He slammed his fist onto my desk. Papers scattered like frightened birds. "Don't play dumb with me, Daniel. You've been scheming. You've been whispering in their ears. You think I don't see it. You're nothing. You'll always be nothing." I let silence hang, then whispered, "Maybe." That single word disarmed him. He expected groveling denial, maybe tears, but not calm acceptance, not quiet defiance. His lips curled into a snarl, but he left, muttering curses under his breath. What he didn't know was that his meltdown had been recorded. Raj, desperate for redemption after being dragged into suspicion, had given me access to the building's internal mic system. Every rage-filled word Victor spewed at me was neatly saved on a drive labeled insurance. By Wednesday, the board suspended Victor pending investigation. He wasn't fired, not yet. But he was stripped of authority, his kingdom reduced to rubble. And oh, how the mighty raged. He lashed out at everyone, sending furious emails at 3 a.m., storming into people's offices, trying to strong-arm loyalty with threats. Some of his old clique clung to him like rats on a sinking ship, but most began to scatter. No one wanted to be dragged down with him. But my revenge wasn't complete. Not even close. Exposing Victor was just the first cut. The real revenge was against all of them. The ones who had laughed, who had watched, who had let me suffer in silence. They thought they were safe because they hadn't thrown the punches themselves. They thought inaction absolved them. But silence is its own weapon, and theirs had sliced me deeper than Victor's words ever could. So I began the next phase. I fed more files into the system, little truths about the others. Karen, who had embezzled small amounts over years. Mike, who had falsified his overtime. Even the senior director who had covered up a failed contract to protect his bonus. All of it, wrapped in neat little packages, leaked, anonymously to the right inboxes. I didn't need to reveal myself. I only needed to show the board, the auditors, the press that rot wasn't isolated. It was everywhere. The office turned into a battlefield of paranoia. Colleagues who once laughed together now whispered accusations. Friendships cracked, alliances dissolved. People avoided eye contact, fearful that anyone could be the next to fall. The laughter that had once filled the air when I stumbled or spilled coffee was gone. Replaced with silence. The kind of silence that screams louder than noise. Melissa watched it all unfold, her eyes flicking to me sometimes, as if she suspected. But she never asked. Maybe she didn't want to know. Maybe part of her enjoyed watching the empire crumble. And I continued to play my role. I still fumbled papers, still wore the same old shirts, still kept my head low. To them, I was still Daniel the weakling, Daniel the pushover. None of them suspected the storm they feared was being orchestrated by the very man they ignored. One night, long after everyone had left, I stood in the empty office, staring out at the city lights. The reflection in the glass showed a man no longer hunched, no longer meek. I whispered, "They thought I was nothing. They thought I was helpless. But look at them now." The taste of revenge was intoxicating, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Victor still breathed, still clung to the edges of power like a desperate beast. And until I crushed him completely, until I made him beg for the mercy he never gave me, my work wasn't finished. The weeks that followed were a slow unspooling. Victor clung to the edges of his life like a man clutching a cliff's ledge, nails white, breath ragged. He made public statements, defensive, hollow, begging for patience while the investigation ran its course. The board pretended impartiality, but their eyes had already shifted away from him. He was a liability now, his name a stain. I watched from the fluorescent, lit trenches of my cubicle as the man who had ruled by ridicule began to unravel in private. He drank more, grew sloppier, and the small triumph of seeing him diminish tasted bitter, because I could see he still had fight left. I wanted him broken, not simply displaced. I wanted him to look at me and realize that for years he had been feeding on a corpse he thought was alive. One late evening, when the office hummed with the tired air, conditioning and the janitor's radio mumbled old songs, I found Victor in the executive washroom, hands pressed to the cool tile, his reflection a man I almost recognized. He looked up when I entered, surprise and something like hatred flashing across his face. "What do you want?" He spat, voice cracked. I leaned against the opposite sink, my posture still the slumped, defeated man they all remembered. "Nothing," I said softly. "Just checking on you. You seemed unwell." He laughed, a harsh crack that echoed off ceramic. "Save your charity. You enjoy this, don't you, watching me burn? You built a whole little theater for yourself." "There's a difference between watching and ending," I replied. "And charity isn't my style." He lunged as if to shove me, but his hand trembled and his shove was more show than force. "You'll regret this," he muttered, voice low enough to be lost in the plumbing. "I'll make sure you never work again." "You already tried that," I said. "It didn't work." My voice was quiet but steady. "You forget. People remember more than you think." That night, he sent frantic messages to ex-colleagues, tried to dig up dirt on me, to smear the leaks as fabrications. He wanted to make this personal. I let him. Anger makes people sloppy, desperation makes them vulnerable. As he clawed at whatever straw would buoy him, I prepared the final stages. I began to reach beyond the office. Victor's world wasn't contained within cubicles and conference rooms. He had a network, clients who winked when numbers were cooked, a web of favors that kept him cushioned. If I could pull at those threads, the whole patchwork would tear. I hired a private investigator. No, not to dig dirt in a seedy way, but to find the human elements Victor used as insurance. Names, relationships, little soft spots where loyalty cost more than it was worth. What I found was a tangle of betrayals. Victor had lent money to a mother running a daycare, taken advantage of a vendor's small business, whispered promises to his mistress that included financial arrangements he never intended to honor. These weren't crimes that put him in jail, but they were human fractures, things that would make the board uncomfortable, clients nervous, and the press hungry. I started to feed those fractures to the right people. A vendor received a discreet message about unpaid invoices. A client discreetly learned of the shaky foundations under a supposed stable leadership. Someone called the local business journal with a tip about Victor's conflicts of interest. The trick was finesse. No single blow that could be written off as vengeance, but a steady erosion that made people rethink their loyalty. And then I turned my attention to his pride. Victor had once used his social circle like a shield. He invited powerful men to golf outings, to charity galas where photos could be staged and reputations polished. I began attending those events in the faintest of ways, an email here, a conversation there, nothing overt. But I made sure that the right whispers reached the right ears. A board member's spouse heard that Victor's charity had questionable receipts. A client's partner was told of a lavish weekend Victor billed as business. The social scaffolding began to creak. One evening, at a gala where Victor smiled like a man who'd convinced himself the storm had passed, I watched him from across the room. He held a glass of wine with the same practiced ease with which he once held my humiliation. Cameras lit the stage, laughter rolled like a rehearsed tide, but shadows moved underneath. A reporter, tipped earlier by an anonymous source, approached and asked a few casual questions. Victor answered, confident, then faltered when the reporter's pen paused on a line about financial transparency. The next morning, the paper carried a piece. Careful, cautious, but the implication was a chisel to his public facade. Clients began to ask for explanations. One by one, partnerships were put on hold pending audits. The board convened again, colder now, more clinical. I watched as people who had laughed at me now watched the man they'd protected being inspected under harsh light. I felt no triumph in his downfall, only the heavy satisfaction of a plan executed without a tremor. But revenge is a river that gathers speed. It had become more than I'd intended, I had set out to be seen, to force acknowledgement for the years I'd been crushed. Now the currents had grown, sweeping not just Victor, but everyone who had let cruelty become currency. Walking home that night, I realized the person staring back at me in storefront reflections was not only someone who had reclaimed himself, but someone who had reshaped the lives of many, some for justice, others for ruin. There was still a final thing to do. Victor had always loved control, loved spectacle. He wanted a stage to beg for his job back. A speech that would frame him as the victim of a smear campaign. I could have let him stand on that stage and flail, let him plead. But there was a final move that would put him not in the role of victim but of consequence. Something that would force him to reckon without the theatrics. So I arranged a meeting. Not at the office, but at the small community center where many of the company's volunteer programs met. I called it a reconciliation forum, an open space for employees to speak directly about the culture that had allowed abuse. I invited the board, the press, everyone. I made sure Victor knew he could come and face the crowd. I wanted truth stripped of spin. He arrived pale and furious, expecting a tribunal. Instead, he found a room full of faces, some sympathetic, some stone, cold, all changed. People told stories that night, small cruelties, overlooked contributions, the slow corrosion of dignity. When it was Victor's turn, he looked around as if searching for allies. There were none. He stammered, tried to explain, but the words fell flat. There was no stage, there was only accountability. As he left that night, shoulders slumped, phone buzzing with canceled contracts and cold, final messages, I felt the last weight slip from my shoulders. I had not sought to ruin a man for the joy of it, I had sought to reveal a truth and call for consequence. The line between justice and vengeance had been thin, and I had walked it carefully. Standing outside under the yellow streetlights, I felt a tiredness settle in, an exhaustion that felt like peace. The night of that forum lingered in the air long after it ended. For days, the office felt like a graveyard after a storm. The laughter, the chatter, the casual cruelty, all of it had vanished. People spoke in whispers now, as though afraid of awakening something they had tried to bury. They looked at me differently too. No one mocked, no one smirked when I passed. But it wasn't respect, not yet. It was something closer to unease. They didn't understand what had changed, but they knew the man they once ridiculed was no longer the same. Victor, meanwhile, was finished. The board announced his termination within the week. Not a polite resignation, not a stepping down for personal reasons. They used the word terminated, harsh. Final, his name disappeared from the company website overnight. His office was emptied in silence, escorted by security. I watched from my desk as he walked past for the last time. His eyes found mine, hollow and defeated, and for the briefest moment, I saw recognition flicker there. He finally understood. I had never been weak, I had been waiting. But revenge rarely leaves you untouched. The collapse of Victor left behind a vacuum, and the office descended into chaos. Senior staff scrambled to distance themselves, while those who once laughed at me now tripped over themselves to feign kindness. Karen stopped by my desk with forced smiles, offering help with projects. Mike clapped me on the back too hard, saying, "Knew you had it in you, buddy." Their hypocrisy was nauseating. I had no interest in their sudden camaraderie. They were rats searching for the next safe ship, and I wasn't about to let them think mine was it. So I set the record straight. In a meeting called to address the new culture of the company, I stood for the first time without a slouch, without an apologetic smile. My voice was calm, steady, but it cut through the room like a blade. I told them what they had done. Not just Victor, but all of them, the laughter, the silence, the complicity. You let cruelty thrive? I said, my eyes sweeping across faces that couldn't meet mine. You watched a man be broken down day after day and thought your silence made you innocent. But silence is its own weapon, and you wielded it well. The room was suffocatingly quiet. Some looked ashamed. Others looked angry, as if I had exposed too much of their reflection. But it didn't matter. The truth had been spoken aloud, and it would linger long after I stopped talking. From that day forward, I was no longer invisible. Promotions came. Opportunities arrived, doors that had been locked tight suddenly swung open. But I didn't take them. Not all of them, at least. Because revenge had taught me something deeper. Power wasn't about titles or corner offices. Power was about choice. And my choice was to never again let them define me. Melissa thrived in the aftermath. She became a voice in the company, respected, unafraid. Sometimes she looked at me with a question in her eyes, as if she still wondered just how much I had orchestrated, how much had been accident, and how much had been deliberate. I never told her. Some truths are more powerful when left unspoken. Victor disappeared from the city's whispers soon enough. Rumors said he tried starting a consulting firm, but no one trusted his name anymore. Others claimed he drank away what little he had left. I never checked. I didn't need to. His downfall wasn't my future. My life had moved forward. One evening, months later, I returned to the rooftop where I had once whispered promises to myself under the cold wind. The city stretched out before me, alive, restless, unaware of the battles fought within its towers. I stood tall, no longer hunched, no longer hiding. For years, I had been the man they thought weak, the man they dismissed, the man they broke. But I was also the man who waited, who endured, who struck when the time was right. And now, as the wind carried the city's noise around me, I whispered not in anger, not in vengeance, but in certainty. I pretended to be weak and helpless. Until the day I showed them my real power. The words weren't just a memory anymore, they were my truth. The story ends not with laughter, not with tears, but with silence. The silence of a man who has reclaimed himself, and the silence of a world that finally sees him.